All right, this week we're going to talk a little bit more about successful people through history and how they've used the power of planning and reflection to achieve their success. This week we're going to turn to the icons of art. So we're going to look at three people. We're going to look at Leonardo da Vinci, Beethoven, and of course, Jerry Seinfeld.
Welcome to the Living Life Our Way podcast, a podcast dedicated to helping you live intentionally. Our goal is to take back control of our lives by living life on our terms. Join us as we work towards living life our way.
Welcome back. I'm Jeff.
And I'm Troy.
And we're going to start with Beethoven. So Beethoven, obviously one of the greatest composers of all time. One thing we didn't know about him is actually kind of a comic guy.
Yeah, he in spite of really some challenging life experiences, he maintained a pretty decent sense of humor and optimism. So that's kind of a cool thing.
Yeah. So something that a lot of people know about Beethoven is he went deaf, which, I mean, in theory would make it next to impossible to compose. But because he'd had such a great amount of reflection and kind of that ability to really process music in his mind, he was still able to continue to compose in spite of the fact that he couldn't hear anything.
Right. You know, he'd internalized a lot of the theories and a lot of the interactions between, notes and chords and so he was able to leverage what he processed internally in a way that's, remarkable to output some of the, the greatest works of music ever. And it's interesting to look and see how his experiences are really reflective and really sort of enliven the majesty of his music.
Yeah, there's no question that both the good and the bad, you can just feel that in the way he composed music.
Right. There's a depth of emotion that is evoked, especially in some of the more the despair that you find in some of the dissonance and some of the minor chords and elements of his music, and it's in part it's that sort of sadness that you feel in a lot of the early portions of some of his real masterworks that lead to this triumph in the end. And I'm thinking of particularly his Ninth Symphony, and the Ode to Peace, or his fourth movement that is just so triumphant and so jubilant, but really is built on the back of a lot of chaotic crescendos and a lot of dissonance that exists in the first three movements of his of that work and other works, and it really reflects his life. That is his ability to reflect internally, even when deaf, and sort of place himself and his experiences into the music, which is is why it's such powerful music.
Yeah, so really two takeaways from Beethoven is the power of reflection to just hone your craft, whatever that is, to really dial that in and to continue to progress through adversity, but then to really use that reflection as well to kind of expand your depth of emotion. It's amazing that he had so much trials and tribulation, and in spite of that was able to overcome that and do so in a way that really embodied those experiences.
Yeah, and you look at some of his personal letters, and they are very honest in his fears and frustrations and in his struggles. They have a real authenticity in terms of what he was going through, but are always subjugated or always overcome by an optimism and gratitude that wins out. And I think that that's part of his genius was because he went deaf, we know that, but he also was very unlucky in money and love, and he had a challenging life, and yet there was an exuberance that is manifest because his reflections ultimately allowed the acknowledgement of the challenges, but the triumph of the gratitude and the optimism, which is just, it's powerful. And I think that's why so much of his music is just so moving.
Yeah, certainly a lesson to be learned there, that it doesn't reflecting on challenges doesn't necessarily need to lead you to the path of despair.
Correct. I think that a lot of it is better understanding, and then it contributes some added fibers to the tapestry of your optimism, of your gratitude, because you are not controlled by those circumstances. You, in spite of those circumstances, overcome, which is, the pinnacle of human spirit, I guess.
Yeah, so with that, we'll shift a little bit to a more comical note and move on to Jerry Seinfeld. So Jerry Seinfeld, obviously a master of observational humor. He took a show about nothing and made it into a pop culture icon that is widely regarded by most people who grew up who lived through the 80s as one of the greatest shows of all time.
For sure. Yes, and it's fun to look at how he takes the mundane, the trivial of life, and converts it, along with George and Elaine and Kramer, into just this comedic masterpiece. He's just a virtuoso at finding the normal and making it feel not only unnormal but enormously entertaining. So
yeah, totally relatable, but in a way that kind of drives you to the laughter.
For sure.
It's in his shows, he would go to these smaller clubs and perform a show, and he would take fastidious notes about what worked, what hit with the audience, and what things didn't. And it allowed him to develop this system for really almost driving a tempo of his show that crescendoed with laughter and then would kind of build and build and build, and then the next laugh came.
Right.
So
right. And I think that, what's interesting is you look at how he systematized some of that reflection, and, in a pretty, seemingly a pretty honest critique of how things went. It's what I think of as film study,
Totally.
And as we've talked about, our, this idea of personal velocity, that notion of film study, where it's an opportunity to reflect, evaluate what works and what doesn't work, non-critically, meaning not to induce guilt or regret or anything like that, but just to say, how do I move forward? How do I progress? And having that really, again, kind of honest, authentic view of yourself, the ability to do that consistently, it's a pretty powerful way to move you forward if you're comfortable saying, I don't need to be perfect, but if I look at what works and doesn't, it'll help me move forward.
Yeah, I know that's certainly something I struggle with, where I just want to be at perfect, and so a lot of times I'll overlook some of my faults, and I think that's something that's human nature, is wanting to not draw attention to your faults, but I think that in shining a light on them, especially personally, maybe not publicly,
right,
but doing so personally allows you to move past those. And the other part with Seinfeld's success was his planning.
Right.
Was really going through and making observations every single day about things that just kind of struck his funny bone.
Right. Don't break the chain.
Yeah.
Is I think what his process is referred to is, don't let days go by without writing material, without finding something that's entertaining and writing jokes about it. And I think that continuity of not only reflecting and being evaluative in terms of how things went for you, but also the planning in terms of not only correcting that, but also knowing that you're constantly putting in the work to continue to advance. So, his success, there's a formula that he followed. Sure, I'm sure he has a lot of natural humor. He's a great storyteller, and some of that just comes naturally. But he honed his craft. He practiced. And that's as important as well as that kind of reflective process.
For sure, I think consistency really is the way to develop significant progress.
Right. No, agreed.
So Da Vinci.
Leonardo.
Throwing it way back. Yes. We've talked about it a little bit, but Leonardo, he wasn't named Leonardo da Vinci. That means Leonardo from Vinci.
Right.
That's his city.
Yeah, so it was interesting reading it to find out that it's Leonardo di Ser Piero da Vinci, which is the son of Leonardo, son of Piero of Vinci, which is a town just outside of Florence. So anyway, something I didn't know that I didn't know. So.
Yeah, when we talk about Da Vinci, we could be talking about anyone from that city.
Yeah, so Leonardo.
Yes. So one of the greatest polymaths of all time, good at pretty much anything he put his mind to. Composer, artist, inventor, engineer, you name it, he did it and was good at it.
Yes, from anatomy to zoology and almost everything in between he was curious about, and he really experimented and worked through increasing his understanding of such a wide range of things. It's just he died just over 500 years ago, and he still looms as just this amazing intellect. I mean, the intellect is obvious. He's a genius, but also just that he had both the interest and the capacity to explore so many different things and do so, in incredible ways. So, cool guy.
And a huge documenter. We actually, I was over in Italy with my in-laws in March, and we went to the Leonardo hands-on exhibit. And just looking at how many of his notebooks and drawings that we still have and use, and we have a lot of machines that have been based on things that he invented 500 years ago.
Right.
I mean, he's just one of the most prolific
thinkers and creators
of all time.
For sure. And he's, I think while we acknowledge all the things that he had his fingers in, he now is best known as an artist and was at his time as well. And even though we have relatively few pieces of his art, they are amongst the most
complicated
and most well known. Mona Lisa, I think it's hard to argue that it's not the most famous piece of art. And
in spite of the fact that it's on an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper.
A little underwhelming in person, but still remarkably famous. And you look at The Last Supper, really one of the icons. The mural is just amazing and
really moved art forward in a lot of
for sure. Had so
ways.
many interesting techniques that he tested and explored. And so he's an amazing guy. But why we chose him is he took what we're referring to as reflection and planning, and at a personal level, he applied it in a way that we see as really the scientific method, what we refer to as the scientific method now, which he just constantly was evaluating what he learned, trying to understand it, and then planning or taking the next step in sort of advancing that learning, experimenting, drawing the next experiment or the next, observation that he was going to make in order to better understand it. And it was that was the process of his life. So it wasn't something that he sort of had his life and then went to the lab and
totally.
sort of employed this scientific method. It is how he lived. And all of his notes are really what we see there is that process of reflecting.
Yeah.
And what's maybe not quite as clear is inherent in that is planning the what's next.
Totally.
What can I learn next? And a lot of his inventions were responses to something that he had observed. A lot of his inventions were very mundane and practical, and then he had these others that were really the science fiction of his day.
Absolutely.
But it was always about this sort of reflection, and then sort of what's the next step.
Yeah, I think that an important part of the scientific process is asking a question. That's the first step, and the second step is creating a hypothesis, is making your best educated guess. And that's really what we've kind of started talking about with this daily practice of planning and reflection is we ask our question, what is going to move us forward the fastest?
Right.
And then we make a hypothesis about that. And then the reflection is really coming back and saying, is that is that going to move us forward the fastest, or is it going to be something else?
Yeah, and importantly, the ask the question is also, that is the output of the reflection.
Yeah.
Meaning we take a look at what we've learned, and oftentimes what happens is we broaden or fill the view, and now a question that we hadn't even contemplated comes to mind. I mean, we're saying, what's the next step? So it really is, and we've talked about maybe exploring this in a little bit more detail, this relationship between the scientific method and this notion of personal reflection and planning. But it's what made Leonardo was that he was very intentional, very systematic in reflecting on what he'd learned, and then looking at what that next step looks like. When he's painting and he's looking at how do I draw, these bodies, these figures, anatomy became a natural next step. Totally. I want to better understand how, the muscular system works or whatever else. So it's really, he's such an interesting case study in terms of just personal progress, and just relentless personal progress.
Yeah, that cross-disciplinary connections really is what comes out of. We talked about Grace Hopper and that cross-disciplinary between coding and business acumen.
Right.
That's where the magic happens, is that cross-disciplinary connection.
And I think that when we are reflecting consistently and consciously and intentionally, that's where we can draw some of those networks that we just aren't going to, that aren't evident without stepping back a little bit.
Yeah, so, I mean, you look at Seinfeld and his daily practice.
Right.
Just doing that every day, you're making connections that you never would otherwise if you're not kind of reflecting on your day and then planning what you're going to do next.
Indeed. Good stuff.
We've really enjoyed talking about planning and reflection. It's certainly not the last you're going to hear from us about it, but we're so grateful for everyone who's listened, who comments and lets us know kind of ways that we can improve, because we're always looking for kind of that consistent progress.
Yes, exactly.
So if you want to help us out, leave a review or leave us a comment, subscribe on YouTube. We just love to connect with people and get feedback and hear all of their great systems for making progress personally. So as we wrap it up, we're into Tuesday's top performers. Do you want to go first this week?
I'll go first this week. So we just celebrated Memorial Day, and good time to reflect on some of the top performers that have allowed us the world that we now enjoy. So a heartfelt salute to those that have served, and particularly those that have paid the ultimate sacrifice for our country and for the world and for our ability to live the life we live. So much thanks.
Certainly. Thanks so much. And my top performer this week was my brother-in-law, Jack. He got married on Saturday. Always fun to add a new sister-in-law to the family, and fun to celebrate them on Saturday, make new connections with her family, and meet a lot of new people. So it's been a great weekend.
That's awesome.
So we look forward to having Haley as part of our family.
Great. Well, very good. Well, thanks for joining us again. Subscribe, leave a comment, leave a review, anything that you feel inclined to do, we sure appreciate.
And we'll look forward to seeing you in the next one.